Have you ever had the feeling that you are somehow out of sync with the world around you? Not in a way that announces itself loudly, not in a way that causes obvious conflict or dramatic failure, but in a quieter and more persistent way. A feeling that the pace everyone else seems to find natural is somehow not your pace. That the things other people celebrate arriving at early in life, the clear career, the visible success, the settled sense of knowing exactly who you are and where you are going, have simply not appeared for you on the schedule the world seemed to expect, and that somewhere in the gap between what you feel inside and what the world around you seems to reward, there is a question you have never quite been able to stop asking. Why does it take me so long? Why does my path look so different? Why do I feel so much more than I can easily explain? Carl Jung spent the greater part of his life investigating exactly this kind of person, not the person who adapts quickly, who fits smoothly into the available roles, who finds early success by learning to speak the language of the collective with fluency and ease, but the person who cannot quite manage that, whose inner life is too complex, too layered, too insistent on its own reality to be easily compressed into the shapes the world offers, whose development does not follow the conventional timeline, not because something is wrong with them, but because something is different, something that will not reveal its full significance until much later, when the qualities that once made them feel out of place turn out to be exactly what makes them capable of something others are not. Jung called these people the rarest personalities, and he believed with a certainty built from decades of clinical observation and deep personal experience that their path to genuine success is different from the path the world most readily recognizes. It is slower, it is more interior, it is less immediately legible to the outside world, but it is in the end more real, more enduring, more fully their own. If you have spent years wondering why you have not yet arrived at the place you feel you are meant to reach, if you have watched others move through the conventional stages of success with a speed and smoothness that left you feeling perpetually behind, if you carry something inside you that you have never been quite able to name, but have never been able to ignore, then what follows may be less a new idea and more a recognition of something you have already known without ever having the language to say it clearly. Number 1. The rarest personality, and why the world does not recognize it early. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the first half of life with a persistent sense of not quite fitting. They are not necessarily unhappy in the conventional sense. They often function well, sometimes very well. They are capable and often genuinely talented. But there is something about the way the world rewards and recognizes people that never quite matches the way they actually are. The things the world celebrates first: speed, social fluency, the ability to project confidence before it has been genuinely earned, the capacity to choose a direction quickly and commit to it fully without needing to understand it deeply. These are precisely the things that come least naturally to the rarest personality. Jung identified this type through years of careful observation of the people who came to him in crisis, often in midlife, often after what appeared from the outside to be perfectly adequate or even impressive lives. What he found again and again was a particular profile. People of unusual depth and unusual sensitivity. People whose inner life was genuinely more complex than the lives they had been living. People who had managed the first half of life by learning to suppress or redirect their most essential qualities in order to fit into a world that did not quite have a place for what they actually were, and who had arrived at midlife with a growing sense that the suppression had cost them something they could no longer afford to ignore. What are the qualities that define the rarest personality? Jung described them in various ways across his writing, but certain themes recur consistently. An inner life that is unusually rich and unusually active. A sensitivity to things other people do not seem to notice, to undercurrents in relationships, to the gap between what is said and what is meant, to the emotional weather of a room, to the deeper patterns operating beneath the surface of events. A capacity for depth of thought and depth of feeling that is genuine, but that does not always translate easily into the forms of performance the world tends to reward. A tendency to question what others accept. A reluctance to commit fully to a direction that does not feel genuinely and essentially their own. A recurring sense that what they carry inside has not yet found its true form of expression in the world, These qualities are not weaknesses, though they are very often experienced as such in early life, when the world is primarily interested in adaptation, in fitting in acquiring the credentials and performing the roles that mark a person as successfully on track. In early life, the rarest personality pays a real price for what they are. They are often slower to commit to conventional paths because their inner sense of what is true for them is too demanding to be satisfied by what is merely adequate. They are often misread by others and sometimes by themselves as indecisive or overly sensitive or not quite ready, when in reality they are simply not willing to simplify themselves to fit a template that was not designed for the kind of life they are meant to live. Jung understood this with unusual clarity, partly because he recognized the pattern from his own experience. His own development was neither smooth nor quickly legible. His inner life was extraordinarily complex. His path diverged early and sharply from the conventional directions available to him, and the qualities that made him difficult to categorize in early life turned out to be exactly the qualities that allowed him to do work that no one else could have done. The rarest personality, Jung believed, does not succeed early because it cannot afford to. Its genuine success requires a kind of maturation that simply takes longer, a deepening that cannot be rushed, an integration of complexity that the conventional timeline of achievement does not have room for. Number 2, the shadow of early invisibility and what it costs. There is a particular kind of pain that belongs specifically to the rarest personality in early life, and it is a pain that is very difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it. It is not the pain of obvious failure or dramatic crisis. It is quieter than that and in some ways more insidious. It is the pain of being perpetually adjacent to the world's recognition without quite arriving inside it, of being capable of more than the world can yet see, of carrying something significant and not having any reliable way to know whether it will ever find its form. Jung spoke often about what he called the inferior function, the least developed and most unconscious dimension of the psyche, the part of a person that is weakest and most vulnerable and most prone to being caught off guard by circumstances that more developed people navigate with ease. For the rarest personality, the inferior function is very often the capacity for straightforward external performance, for presenting a simplified, confident, easily legible version of themselves to the world, and having that version be convincing and rewarded. They can often do it. They learn to do it in many cases with a great deal of skill. But it costs them more than it costs others, and it never quite feels like them. The cost of that performance, sustained over years, is what Jung identified as a particular form of psychological depletion that is different from ordinary tiredness. It is the depletion that comes from living at a distance from your own center, from spending the majority of your energy on the performance of a version of yourself that is real but not primary, that is capable but not essential, that functions but does not fully live. The rarest personality can sustain this performance for a long time because they are genuinely capable and genuinely motivated. But underneath the performance, the true inner life continues its own process, its own deepening, its own gradual movement toward a form of expression that the world has not yet offered the right conditions for. What makes this period particularly painful is the quality of doubt it generates. When the conventional markers of success arrive slowly or not at all, when the path that others seem to find relatively straightforward remains obscure or keeps changing direction, it is almost impossible not to wonder whether the problem is you, whether the depth you feel inside is real or imagined, whether the sense that you are meant for something specific and significant is genuine perception or elaborate self-deception. Jung believed this doubt is almost always part of the process for the rarest personality. It is not a sign that they are wrong about themselves. It is a sign that they have not yet found the conditions in which what they carry can become fully visible, to themselves or to others. The shadow of early invisibility also manifests in the quality of comparison that haunts the rarest personality in their younger years. Watching others arrive at the visible markers of success, the clear career, the recognized achievement, the social confidence that reads as having figured something out, while still carrying a sense of incompletion, of something not yet ready, of potential not yet translated into legible form, is a particular kind of difficulty. Jung understood this not as a motivation problem or a discipline problem, but as a timing problem. The rarest personality is not slower because they are less. They are slower because what they are becoming is more complex than what can be assembled quickly. Number 3. Why depth takes longer than performance. One of the most clarifying ideas in Jung's entire body of work is his distinction between the persona and the self. The persona, as Jung described it, is the social mask, the adapted, presented performance of self that we develop in order to function in the social world, in order to be recognized and accepted and able to participate in the collective life of the community we belong to. The self is the deeper totality of who we actually are, including the conscious dimensions we are aware of and the unconscious dimensions we are still in the process of discovering. Most people, Jung observed, spend the first half of life developing an increasingly convincing and functional persona. They learn the rules of the social world, the language of the institutions they participate in, the behavior that signals competence and belonging. They build an identity that is legible to others and that allows them to acquire the resources and the relationships that adult life requires. This process is real and necessary. Jung never disparaged it, but he also recognized that it is not the whole of what a human life is for. And the person who succeeds primarily through the development of an effective persona, who optimizes for external legibility and social recognition, often arrives at midlife with a persona that functions very well, but a self that has been significantly neglected. The rarest personality has a different, and in some ways more difficult relationship with this distinction. Because their inner life is unusually complex and unusually insistent, they cannot as easily separate the performance of from the felt reality of self. When the two diverge too sharply, they experience it as a specific kind of wrongness that they cannot ignore the way people with simpler inner lives sometimes can. They feel the gap between who they are presenting and who they actually are as a genuine and persistent source of discomfort that does not resolve on its own, that continues to press for attention, that makes the conventional first half of life path of persona development and external achievement feel somehow insufficient even when it is working. This insistence of the inner life is, paradoxically, both the rarest personality's greatest difficulty and their greatest asset. It is a difficulty because it makes the conventional path more costly, more uncomfortable, more prone to the kind of questioning and doubling back that looks from the outside like indecision or instability. It is an asset because it means that when the rarest personality finally finds the conditions in which their genuine depth can begin to express itself in the world, what they bring is not merely a well-developed persona. It is something far more real, far more capable of speaking to the genuine complexity of human experience in a way that a more purely persona-based form of success simply cannot. Jung wrote that what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. For the rarest personality, the inner life that cannot be suppressed indefinitely eventually finds its way out, not always smoothly or conveniently, but inevitably. And when it does, when the conditions are finally right for the depth that has been accumulating through all the years of difficulty and questioning and apparently slow development, to begin finding its form in the world, the results are often extraordinary in ways that could not have been predicted from the outside, and that the person themselves often did not see coming. Number 4. The turning point that others miss. There is a particular moment in the life of the rarest personality that is easy to misread from the outside. It often looks to others like a crisis, a breakdown of the conventional path, a period of apparent instability or withdrawal or loss of direction. A moment when what was working, more or less, stops working, and the person enters a period that does not resemble success by any of the conventional measures. Jung called this moment the individuation crisis, and he understood it not as a failure but as a necessary transition, the moment at which the first half of life's priorities, the building of the persona, the acquisition of external markers of competence and belonging, begin to be revealed as insufficient for what the second half of life requires. The question shifts from who do others need me to be, to who am I, actually and essentially, beneath all the adaptation and performance and role-playing that the first half of life required of me. For the rarest personality, This crisis often arrives earlier than it does for people whose first half of life success was more complete and more satisfying. Because the rarest personality was never entirely at home in the persona they were building, because the gap between their outer life and their inner reality was always more uncomfortable for them than it was for others, the pressure of that gap tends to build more quickly and to demand resolution sooner. The crisis can take many forms: a period of profound restlessness, the collapse of a path that seemed to be working, a relationship or a career or an identity that can no longer be maintained in its current form, a form of depression or anxiety or numbness that does not respond to the usual remedies because it is not at its root a medical problem but a psychological one, a signal from the neglected inner life that the time for suppression has ended. Jung saw all of these as potential manifestations of the same underlying pressure, the pressure of the self that has been waiting for the conditions to become fully real, pressing against the limits of the persona that has been containing it. What makes this turning point so significant for the rarest personality is what becomes possible on the other side of it. If the crisis is met with genuine curiosity rather than managed with suppression, if the person is willing to enter the discomfort of not knowing and to remain in it long enough for something new to begin forming, what emerges is often something that was simply not available before, a clarity about what they actually are and what they are actually for, that is more real and more enduring than any of the more easily achieved identities of the first half of life, a capacity to work from genuine depth rather than from performed competence, a form of presence in the world that is unmistakably and unreproducibly their own. This is why Jung believed so firmly that for the rarest personality, genuine success almost always comes later, not because they were always going to be slow, but because the kind of success they are capable of requires a degree of self-knowledge and inner integration that simply cannot be rushed, that is built through exactly the years of difficulty and questioning and apparent delay that the rarest personality so often experiences as failure or inadequacy when they are living through them. Number 5. What the rarest personality builds that others cannot. When the rarest personality reaches the other side of their long and difficult preparation, something very specific becomes available to them that is not available to people whose path was smoother and more conventional. Jung identified this as the capacity for what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites together without collapsing into one side or the other, to remain in genuine tension between conflicting realities until something new emerges that is not a compromise between them, but a genuine integration of both. This capacity is rare. It is genuinely rare. Most people, when faced with a genuine opposition between two true things, default to one side. They choose certainty over complexity. They choose the available answer over the real question. They choose the comfort of a resolved position over the discomfort of genuine not knowing. This is not a moral failure. It is a very natural response to the genuine difficulty of holding opposites, which requires a quality of psychological endurance that most people have not been required to develop. The rarest personality, by contrast, has been living with opposites for their entire life. The opposition between who they actually are and who the world needed them to be. The opposition between the depth they feel inside and the simpler forms of self that were required for external functioning. The opposition between the sense that something real and significant is waiting to emerge and the very real possibility that they are wrong about themselves. This sustained experience of opposition, this lifelong practice of remaining in tension without resolving it prematurely, is exactly what builds the transcendent function in those who are capable of developing it. What this means practically is that the rarest personality, once they have moved through their long preparation, becomes capable of something that is genuinely distinctive and genuinely valuable. They can think in complexity without losing clarity. They can feel deeply without losing the capacity for effective action. They can hold the truth of their own experience alongside the truth of others' experience without needing to choose between them. They can see what is real in situations that are genuinely difficult and genuinely ambiguous, in exactly the kinds of situations where people with simpler and more quickly assembled identities tend to default to formulaic responses that miss what is actually happening. Jung believed that the world, in the long run, needs this capacity more than it needs almost anything else: the ability to remain present to genuine complexity, to resist the temptation of premature resolution, to bring something genuinely real to situations that require more than competence, that require wisdom. This is what the rarest personality, after their long and difficult preparation, is uniquely capable of providing, not because they are superior to others in some general sense, but because the very qualities that made their early life more difficult than others, their refusal to simplify themselves, their insistence on depth, their inability to be entirely satisfied by what is merely adequate, turn out to be exactly the qualities that make them capable of something the more smoothly adapted person cannot offer. Number 6. Learning to trust the slower path. Perhaps the most difficult thing about being the rarest personality is not the difficulty itself. It is the sustained uncertainty about whether the difficulty means anything, whether the slowness is preparation or simply slowness, whether the depth is real or imagined, whether the sense of something significant waiting to emerge is genuine perception or a story told to make the difficulty bearable. Jung understood this uncertainty as a fundamental feature of the rarest personality's experience, not as an occasional doubt but as a persistent companion, a voice that never entirely goes away, that is always willing to offer the interpretation that what feels like depth is merely delay, that what feels like preparation is merely avoidance, that the conventional path would have been better after all. Learning to live with this uncertainty, not by resolving it prematurely but by developing a genuine and experientially grounded trust in the reality of the inner process, is, Jung believed, one of the most essential tasks of the rarest personality's development. And it cannot be accomplished through an act of will. It cannot be achieved by deciding to believe in yourself. As the available self-help literature so confidently recommends, it can only come through the gradual accumulation of genuine inner experience, through the practice of listening to what is actually moving inside and following it, even when it leads away from the more immediately legible path. What helps is not reassurance from outside, though that can have its place. What helps is the development of a genuine relationship with your own inner process, the practice of noticing what is true for you, not what is convenient or impressive or easily explained, but what is actually true, and returning to it again and again as the guiding reference point for your choices, not because it will always lead you somewhere comfortable or immediately recognizable as success, but because it is the only compass you have that is actually oriented toward the life that is genuinely yours to live. Jung described this relationship with the inner process as the central work of the second half of life, not achievement, not the accumulation of further external markers of success, but the deepening of the relationship with the self, the ongoing process of bringing more of what you actually are into conscious awareness and into genuine expression. For the rarest personality, this work often begins earlier than it does for others, precisely because the first half of life's conventional path was never entirely satisfying, never entirely right, never entirely enough to quiet the voice of the inner life that kept insisting on something more real. Trust in the slower path is not naivety. It is not the decision to wait passively for something to arrive. It is the active, daily, often difficult practice of remaining faithful to what is most genuinely true inside you, even when the evidence available to the outside world does not yet confirm that this faithfulness is going anywhere worth going. Jung believed, and the evidence of his own extraordinary life seemed to confirm, that this faithfulness is never finally wasted, that what is built through genuine inner development, through the long and sometimes painful process of becoming more fully yourself, is not diminished by the time it takes. It is deepened by it. Number 7. The second half of life and what becomes possible. There is a particular quality of life that becomes available to the rarest personality in the second half of their years that is simply not available earlier, not because they were holding it back, not because circumstances were preventing it, but because it genuinely requires everything that came before in order to exist. It requires the long years of difficulty and questioning, the sustained experience of not quite fitting, the repeated practice of remaining with what is true, even when the world cannot yet see it, the gradual integration of all the complexity that the first half of life could not contain. All of this is not a price paid for something that arrives later. It is the substance of what arrives later. It is the material from which what becomes possible is made. Jung wrote that the second half of life has its own purpose and its own meaning that is entirely different from the first half. The first half is, broadly, about building the structures necessary for functioning in the world, building an identity robust enough to sustain engagement with the social and professional environment, building the relationships and the resources that adult life requires. The second half is broadly about depth, about the movement inward, about the gradual translation of what was accumulated and endured and developed in the first half into something more essentially one's own. Into wisdom, if that word is understood not as a kind of superior knowledge but as a particular quality of integration, a way of being in the world that carries the full weight of genuine experience. For the rarest personality, this transition into the second half of life and its particular kind of depth is often the moment when everything that came before finally begins to make sense. When the qualities that were liabilities in early life become recognizable as gifts. When the depth that made them difficult to fit into conventional categories becomes the very thing that allows them to perceive and respond to what is real in situations where others see only the surface. When the long years of inner development that looked from the outside like delay or difficulty or failure to arrive turn out to have been exactly the preparation required for the kind of contribution only they can make. This is not a consolation prize. It is not a story told to make the difficulty bearable in retrospect. It is what Jung observed, repeatedly and consistently, in the lives of the people whose development followed this pattern. The genuine breakthrough, when it came, was almost always in the second half, and it was almost always more significant, more enduring, and more authentically the person's own than anything they could have achieved through the smoother and more conventional path would have been. What becomes possible for the rarest personality in the second half of life is not simply success in the conventional sense, though that often comes as well. What becomes possible is something more valuable and more rare, a way of being in the world that is genuinely and unmistakably their own, a capacity to contribute something that could not have come from anyone else, in exactly the form it takes, because it is made from the specific and irreplaceable substance of this specific person's long and complex and genuine inner development. A presence in the world that carries weight not because it is impressive, but because it is real, deeply, unmistakably, finally real in the way that only things built from genuine depth ever are. If you have spent years wondering whether your path is leading anywhere, whether the qualities that make you difficult to categorize are assets or liabilities, whether the time you have spent in what looks like preparation will ever translate into anything the world can recognize, the answer that Jung's entire body of work offers is not a simple reassurance. It is something more demanding and more real than reassurance. It is the suggestion that the only way to find out is to keep going, to keep being faithful to what is most genuinely true inside you, to keep resisting the temptation to simplify yourself into a shape that the world finds more immediately legible, to keep trusting through all the uncertainty and all the doubt and all the years that seem to pass without the confirmation you are waiting for, that what you are building in the slow and interior and difficult way that is the only way available to you is real, and that it is becoming, gradually and genuinely, the kind of life that only the rarest personality is capable of living. If something in this video touches a part of you that rarely gets touched, if the description of the rarest personality feels less like information being delivered from outside and more like a recognition of something you have always quietly known, leave a word in the comments that names what you recognized. Because sometimes the most important step is simply being willing to say out loud that you have always known you were living a different kind of path. And if you are ready to keep exploring what that path requires and what it makes possible, stay close to this work, not to become someone else, but to finally, fully, without apology or further delay, become who you have always been. There is something worth saying more directly about what it actually feels like to be the rarest personality in the years before the second half of life begins to offer its particular clarity. Because the experience is often described, from the outside, in ways that make it sound more dramatically difficult than it usually is, it is rarely a constant and obvious suffering. It is more often a persistent low-level dissonance, a recurring sense that something is slightly off, that you are standing at a slight angle to the world around you in a way that no one else seems to notice or to share, that the conversations happening around you are almost about what matters, but not quite, that the successes available to you are almost satisfying, but not entirely, that the life you are living is almost yours, but not fully. Jung described this experience with great precision. He understood it as the signal of the individuation process pressing forward from beneath the surface of conscious adaptation. The self, which is always moving toward wholeness, which is always oriented toward a more complete and more genuinely integrated expression of what the person actually is, produces exactly this quality of dissonance when the life being lived is too narrow for what it contains. It is not a pathology. It is a form of intelligence, the psyche registering at a level below conscious articulation, that what is happening in the outer life is not yet aligned with what is developing in the inner life, that there is more here than is currently being expressed, that the form currently available is not yet adequate for the substance waiting to fill it. For the rarest personality, this signal is louder and more persistent than it is for others, because the gap between the inner life and the outer form is wider and more consequential. They cannot easily ignore it. They cannot successfully drown it out with busyness or achievement or the comfort of conventional progress in the way that people with simpler inner lives sometimes can. It keeps returning. It keeps insisting. It keeps refusing to be satisfied by what is merely adequate, by what is good enough, by what everyone else seems to find sufficient. This insistence is exhausting. There is no point in pretending otherwise. Living with a persistent sense that something essential has not yet found its form, while simultaneously functioning in a world that does not recognize the thing you are carrying and cannot validate the path you are on, requires a quality of psychological endurance that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically receives. The rarest personality is not simply waiting patiently for their time to come. They are doing the hard and largely invisible work of maintaining the reality of their inner life against the continuous pressure of a world that cannot yet see what it contains. Jung recognized this endurance as itself a form of development. Each year that the rarest personality maintains their faithfulness to what is genuinely true inside them, without collapsing into the easier simplifications available, without abandoning the depth for the more immediately rewarding surface, without deciding that the dissonance means they were wrong, rather than that the world is not yet ready for what they carry, they are building something, not just waiting for something to build itself. Building it through the practice of remaining honest with themselves about what is real and what matters and what they are unwilling to sacrifice for the sake of an easier or earlier or more conventionally recognizable form of success. This building is slow. It is largely invisible from the outside. It does not produce the kinds of markers that allow others to recognize that something significant is in process. It looks, much of the time, like nothing much happening, like a period of searching or uncertainty or incomplete development. But Jung believed, and the evidence of the lives he studied seemed to confirm, that this slow and invisible building is exactly what produces the particular quality of depth and integration and authentic self-knowledge that makes the rarest personality, once they have moved through it, capable of something genuinely extraordinary, not despite the slowness, because of it, not in spite of the difficulty. Through it, not after the long preparation ends, as its direct and necessary result. The world will not always recognize this. The world often does not recognize it, at least not at first. The world is better at seeing the products of rapid, visible, conventional development than it is at seeing what emerges from the longer, quieter, more interior process. But Jung believed, and it is worth repeating this clearly, that what emerges from the deeper process is ultimately more real, more enduring, and more capable of speaking to what human beings most genuinely need than what emerges from the more rapidly assembled and more immediately legible alternative. The rarest personality's contribution, when it finally arrives in its full form, is not interchangeable with anything else available. It is irreplaceable, it is theirs alone, and it was worth every year of what came before. And so, if you are in the middle of that process right now, if you are somewhere in the long middle of a path that does not yet look like what you were told success should look like. If you are carrying something you cannot fully explain and following a direction you cannot fully justify by the measures the world finds most convincing, Jung's invitation is not to be patient in the passive sense of simply waiting. It is to be faithful, faithful to the reality of your inner life, faithful to the depth you carry even when no one around you can yet see it, faithful to the process that is asking you to remain honest and to remain present even in the absence of external confirmation. Because the faithfulness itself is not preparation for the work. The faithfulness is the work, and what it builds, slowly and genuinely, and in a way that nothing can finally take away, is the only kind of success the rarest personality was ever truly meant to have.